Frasier is a show that almost nobody talked about for about 20 years. It aired at almost exactly the same time as Friends, which has become kind of part of our culture. Why is that? I watched every episode of Frasier to try to figure out why it became less relevant over time. Hi, I'm Stuart and I am your middle-aged hack, just a child of the 80s trying to make his way through the 20s, and I hope you'll take the journey with me. Frasier ran from 1993 to 2004. It won 37 primetime Emmys, which was a record for almost 20 years until Game of Thrones beat it. And yet, Friends, which ran at the same time, is something everybody is aware of, everybody knows, and Frasier, for a long time, nobody ever talked about it. Why? Because Frasier was only mastered into high definition a couple of years ago, while Friends has been high definition since the mid-2000s. This means it was a lot more accessible to people, and if you did go and try to stream it, it just looked awful. The remastering in high definition, in my opinion, was not very good. I think there needed to be more grain reduction, especially in the first couple of seasons. But this really isn't a technical review. This is more about the show itself. I'm sure you're familiar with the show. It revolves around Frasier Crane, who was a supporting character in the show Cheers, which ran from 1982 to 1993. And Frasier finds that his father has to move in with him, and his father is nothing like him, and, hilarity ensues, as they say. And there's a cast of supporting characters, but you probably already know about that. The real question is, does Frasier hold up? And no, in a lot of ways it doesn't. It doesn't. It's still very well made, and you have to take it as a product of its time, but doesn't necessarily hold up as much. One of the reasons that Frasier doesn't really hold up is there are practically no character arcs. There's practically no character growth at all. It's kind of funny. I mean, situations change, and yes, there's the whole thing where Niles and Daphne finally get together, which is a little bit like 3/4 of the way through the series, so that changes the dynamic. But the characters, Frasier and Niles and Martin and Daphne, they're still really the same people at the end of the show that they were at the beginning of the show. And that makes it a little hard from today's point of view to watch it, because this show comes off as incredibly, incredibly episodic. You have to remember that in the 1990s, very few people recorded TV. And so if you missed an episode, you missed pretty much until the summer when it reran. And so there was nothing you could do. There were occasional 2 and 3 episode arcs or hour-long programs, stuff like that. But for the most part, you could shake up these episodes and put them in any order, and you really wouldn't know the difference. There's, Frasier is having problems with his dad. Niles is panting over Daphne, or having issues with Daphne, or not having issues with Daphne. There's a whole subgenre of them having really bad dinner parties over and over and over again. There's a bunch of shows where it's just basically a comedy of errors where people are misplacing or misunderstanding each other in a way that nobody would today with phones. And, so it doesn't really seem any different in 2003 than it did in 1994. The only character who has any real major growth is Roz. Roz plays Frasier's producer in the first episode, and by the end of the series, she is the manager of the radio station. Along the way, she was, portrayed as very promiscuous, and then she had a baby, and she got into a stable relationship. She became a much more mature person, and she's the only one who exhibits any growth. She's really the most enjoyable character for that reason. She's not just, a joke machine. There's things happening to her. It really makes a difference. That's the kind of character development that you see a lot today, but you don't see very much in these 1990s TV shows. You have to look at Frasier, as I said, as a product of its time. And that's why you have to kind of ignore the fact that Roz gets slut-shamed a lot, even into the later episodes. You have to ignore some kind of general homophobia, although the show was fairly progressive for its time. It did show gay couples in a context without pointing a finger and saying, oh, look, there's a gay couple. Still, there's a lot of humor around that. Not as much as Friends, but it still can be a little uncomfortable at times. The show had a revolving cast of guest stars, of course, the people that Frasier was dating, or people that Niles were involved in, or guest callers on the shows. And most of them don't make much of an impact. They have a short moment in the sun, and then for the most part they're gone and never referenced again. The show doesn't really bring up stuff from the past very much. When it does, it's really in a very throwaway context. Because as I said, you had to watch these shows when they aired, and you probably only watched them once, so you're not going to really remember all of that mythology. What I did like about Frasier was that you really got to see an evolution of the time. When the show started in 1993, it was very much a time when everyone wore business suits, every man did, every woman wore floor-length dresses to work or blouses and skirts that were very conservative. And by the time the show ended, people were wearing jeans at work and stuff that was a lot more casual. And more importantly, you got to see Frasier and Niles in a lot more comfortable clothes, where in the first couple of seasons, they were always in suits, always. Now that may seem odd today, but the truth is, there were times when I was working in the 90s where I'd come straight from work and yeah, I'd keep my jacket and tie on, maybe loosen it or something like that. But if I was out, it didn't really change how I dressed compared to the way it was at work. You also get to see a little bit more casual banter at work. You get to see a little bit loosening of what goes on there in one way, and in another way, with some specific episodes, they get a lot tighter in the way that they deal with sexual harassment, which was something that changed in our country in the 1990s, and Frasier really does reflect that. So looking at the first episode versus the last episode, the thing that really gets me is, of course, the fashions, and they really do change. I feel like, fashion for, folks over 30 hasn't changed much since 2014, and yet between 1994 and 2004, you see this huge change in fashion as evidenced on this show. I like the shows where it managed to get out of the formula, because so many of these shows were, these episodes, it was just, okay, Frasier and Niles misunderstand each other, or they bicker, or Frasier and his dad don't get along on something, or Frasier is a pompous jerk, and he's a pompous jerk in a really public way. These plots recycled over and over and over again, and they became part of the throwaway aspect of the show. But there were a couple of episodes that really broke the mold, and I'm thinking of two in particular. There was a standalone episode that starts with Martin sitting in an unfamiliar area talking to an unfamiliar woman who you're not introduced to, and over time you come to realize this is the parole hearing for the person who actually shot Martin. And it's a completely different episode from any of the other ones. I mean, the tone is different, the cast is different, everything is different about it. And I love it when shows take these kind of leaps, as long as they don't do it too often, and as long as they don't get mired in these multi-episode flashbacks. This one was just about perfect. I don't know if it won an Emmy. It probably should have, because it really showed the range that John Mahoney was capable of at that moment. There's another episode, which I believe is called Daphne's Homecoming. The actress herself, Jane Leeves, had become pregnant, and they kind of worked that into the show as her gaining a lot of weight. Fat shaming was still really a thing back then, and so they got to do a lot of jokes at her expense. Because she the actress was going on maternity leave, they had Daphne, the character, go to a fat farm. And when she came back, there was a great episode which began to address the change in dynamic between Niles looking at Daphne as this unachievable perfection of a woman and looking at her as a real life partner. It's done in a way that's technically very well. They used unused cuts from earlier episodes, angles that didn't make it to air, and then blue screened the present day Niles and Frasier onto those episodes. So you really get the feeling like, okay, they're in the midst of recollection, and they didn't do it with just cheap wigs or, it didn't look fake. It didn't look overly made up, because this was actually, David Hyde Pierce in year 2000-ish looking at David Hyde Pierce in 1994. And you can see the difference just in the hair, in the overall aging of the character. Again, very well done, and for its day, very technically advanced. It's those kind of episodes that really kept me coming back to Frasier at times when I just got fed up with the idea that they were going to do another episode where a dinner party went wrong, or another episode where he acts like an idiot to a woman. The last thing that I wanted to discuss was the notion of Frasier as this sort of prissy confirmed bachelor. They always tried to get Frasier to have girlfriends, but it always seemed really uncomfortable. And the undercurrent was, well, maybe Frasier is gay, and that was never really discussed, but at the same time, the characters are kind of really unrealistic. Even for that time, nobody talked or acted like that, not in my circle of friends anyway. And certainly, believe it or not, I actually knew folks who were working in radio in the 1990s, and if you had a 3-hour radio show, there is no way that you could afford a lavish apartment like that and a home health aide and all of the things that Frasier has. It's very unrealistic, but certainly not any different from other 1990s TV shows. You can watch Frasier on a bunch of different platforms. I think it's on Prime Video. I know for a fact it's on Hulu, on Disney Plus with Hulu if you have that, and in high definition on Paramount Plus. You may not want to watch every single episode. Read the descriptions, and if they say dinner party or girlfriend, just skip that one. But there's a bunch that you're really going to like. Meantime, it set me up well for watching the new reincarnation of Frasier, because I realized there was a lot of it that was a continuation that I didn't really realize because I'd kind of forgotten a lot of the show. And it really gives me some real respect for Kelsey Grammer as an actor and producer for a lifelong commitment to this character. I don't think he's just going back to it because he needs the money. I think he really wants to show the audience where this character is going. That's it for me today. Leave a like and subscribe if you can. I sure do appreciate it. I'm trying to build this channel up so I can monetize it, and I cannot do that without your help.